on this small planet of ours, this small and limited, finite environment, we have already set off more than 1,200 nuclear bombs.
This is Muraoa, a small, uninhabited atoll 750 miles southeast of Tahiti, the site chosen by France for her first atomic test explosion in the Pacific. This will be the first of a series of test explosions. France did not sign the Atomic Test Ban Treaty. Now the final seconds of the countdown. The A-bomb, mounted on a tower in a lagoon, turns the sky white at the moment of detonation. The French insisted there would be no danger of radiation increase.
How far does this radiation go when they set off a bomb? I found out in the beginning they said, well, it will only go halfway around the Earth and then it will all be dissipated. And then I found out it goes at least 2.5 times around, and then it makes a big layer out above our Earth's atmosphere, and it slowly makes its way down. And there's a lot out there now still coming. We've already polluted our own Earth to a serious degree. I'm not talking about minor amounts. Now, in addition to what we've done with the above-ground weapon testing, we've set off another 600 to 800 underground blasts and underwater blasts. The French are now actively testing in French Polynesia under the lagoon. The U.S. is actively testing now in Nevada. It's going on right now. It didn't stop. Underground tests emit almost all of the radioactive gases to the air. It traps the solid particles, but it emits the gases. What has this been doing to our Earth? Unless we do some very precise calculations, it's very difficult to tell the difference between a natural earthquake and an earthquake triggered by a nuclear bomb. Another thing that happens with the explosions, especially in the Pacific, is that it blows apart the coral reefs and it leaves open, broken ends of coral. On those broken ends of coral, dinoflagellates, small microorganisms grow. They only grow on broken coral. Those dinoflagellates, if they're eaten by fish, make the fish poisonous. There are now thousands of cases of ciguatera fish poisoning per year in the Pacific Ocean region, most of it occurring in French Polynesia and in the Marshall Islands. It's a secondary effect, not a direct effect of the radioactive poisons. We also have nuclear submarines and nuclear battleships riding around in our fisheries. There's no way a nuclear power plant can operate as a closed system, so routinely these ships dump radioactive material into the ocean. That's the way they operate, that's the way they're designed to operate. They say it's okay because it's within permissible limits. So how much radioactivity we're getting in our fish, we don't know. I've only begun to touch on what has been going on our Earth since 1945. I've not talked about the uranium miners. There are at least 1,100 dead or dying of excess lung cancers in the States, and there are more than 100 now documented by the unions for Canada. I haven't talked about the uranium mills where there's excess leukemia, the people that handle the radioactive material. I haven't talked about the transportation. I haven't talked about the enrichment plants. The enrichment plants where so many have died at Paducah, Kentucky. I haven't talked about the separating out of the plutonium, the taking of the plutonium and making the bombs, all the waste from every part of the cycle. About 100 million tons of uranium waste in the Colorado Plateau, and at least 1 million tons of uranium waste sitting above ground in Canada, washing down in the rain into the water, into the ground, into the food, bathing the North American continent with radon gas. In other words, what is the cost of deterrence? And I'm only counting the fatal cancers, the genetic diseases that will be passed on generation to generation, the congenital malformations, and the stillbirths and spontaneous abortions caused by our radiation pollution since 1946. The number is somewhere conservatively between 16 and 17 million people, dead or serious casualties. This is the pre-war period. These are the people we don't hear about. These are the people who came to tell their story to the World Council of Churches meeting in Vancouver. These are the mothers that held their babies with no faces, no arms, no legs, held them till they died and then buried them so the father didn't see them. This is the cost of deterrence. And how many nuclear weapons do we need?
Scientists have known of the damaging effects of radiation on health since shortly after X-rays were discovered at the turn of the century. The nuclear bombing of Japan in the Second World War caused massive destruction of the environment. We now recognize radiation to be one of the most hazardous substances on Earth, persisting for thousands of years.
One of the difficulties with understanding the relationship between radiation and breast cancer was the Hiroshima and Nagasaki studies. In the beginning, the researchers were looking at what was first cause of death. And so instead of looking at how many people had breast cancer, they looked at deaths. They finally reported an incidence rate. And at that point, we found that breast cancer had tripled in the Japanese population, whereas other cancers more connected with radiation in people's mind, like lung and colon cancer, had doubled. So it was increased by the greatest amount and had been missed by the researchers because of their focus on death.
Exactly how much radiation are we being exposed to? Exactly how much is safe?
There is no level of radiation that will not cause cellular damage.
But in order to see the result of this damage, it sometimes takes 20 or 30 years, called a latency period. In Japan, young girls under age 10 exposed to the radiation, when they reached maturity, had 6 times the expected rate of breast cancer. We sometimes forget that during the atmospheric nuclear weapon testing from 1946 to 63, we blanketed North America with radioactive fallout. It was measured in milk, it was measured in other foods, and children born during that period were exposed in utero and in early childhood to radiation that was not normal to our environment.
And if we look at the source of most of our pollution, we'll find that it comes from preoccupation with creating megadeath.
For example, World War I, chlorine gas was separated out. Since then, we have tens of thousands of compounds containing chlorine, which are not natural to our environment. What we're asking is, once the community has taken an issue and has shown an association between the hazard and the illness, then the burden of proof should shift, and the polluter should have to prove that it's not causing the illness. Most of the efforts to avoid cancer have focused on the individual. So once you recognize a hazard, you can either try to get rid of the hazard or you can try to avoid the hazard. For example, tobacco and smoking. Instead of going after the growers of the tobacco and the pollution in it, we tell people not to smoke. Or instead of going after supersonic planes or atmospheric nuclear testing, which damage the ozone layer, we tell people to stop using underarm deodorant, or it's the refrigerators. There's a difference between mammography for diagnostic purposes and mammography that's used for screening of large numbers of women who aren't sick. Radiation from the mammography can initiate or promote a cancer, and women who are at high risk for cancer are also at high risk from the mammography. I have spoken to radiologists about this, and they tell me that that's okay because if the women stay in the mammography program, they will be able to detect it early, they can have surgery, and they're fine. Well, it's not fine. And there's an ethical problem in causing cancer in some women in order to detect it early in other women. We can't just trade women's lives. There's another problem in mammography which we have to understand, and that is there's two different types of breast cancer. One is slow growing and one is rapidly growing. It's the rapidly growing ones that give us the most trouble. For example, a tumor can double its size in 28 or 29 days. So what you have is if the tumor gets too large, the mammography won't see it. And you need to catch it in the last 28 days where it's between too small to see and large enough to detect with self-examination. If you just have a mammography every 2 years, you're going to miss most of these.
We have generated a situation in which there is no future. There is no future whether we have a major nuclear catastrophe, whether we have a nuclear war, or whether we just keep on poisoning our own beds. We have generated a death process in the species, and if we don't stop it now, then I don't know who's going to stop it. And it's not going to get better unless we make major changes in our attitudes, unless we begin to negotiate in faith, and unless we make up our minds that there is no more war. There is no more war. It's not a way to solve problems. We solve problems by negotiation, by laws, by treaties, by arbitration, by all kinds of intelligent human methods, but we don't solve them by war.